Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station for another interview in my eclectic collection of podcasts and videos. Now, before I start this one, I'd just like to ask a favour of you, if I may. It would appear that the algorithms are limiting my exposure, and anytime I post a new video or podcast, the audience is just not being reached, sadly. So I wonder if you would be able, if you've enjoyed any of the content or this particular one, if you would be able to add it to your social media and spread it amongst your outdoor community. I'd be very grateful to get the message out far and wide. After all, there is over 550 podcasts to listen to going back 17 years. Now, this particular interview today is with John Burns. Now, John is a well-known author and writer of several books relating to the outdoors, living in Scotland, hill walking, and of course, bothies in Scotland as well. And his latest book, the Hot Tent Diaries, is literally that. It's about how to live in a hot tent during the colder months in comfort and enjoy the outdoors throughout the year. Now, John's a fascinating character. It's a very amusing book. I'm sure you'll love it. And of course, links to everything will be in the show notes over on theoutdoorstation.co.uk. And while you're there, please leave a comment and join our newsletter. So here's my interview and conversation with John. Cool. Well, hi, John. Thanks very much for joining us. I think probably the best way to start this is, I know that you've written the book now, the Hot Tent Diaries, but for people that have perhaps don't fully understand what hot tenting is, would you like to explain to people exactly what it consists of?
Yeah, easily. Hot tenting is very different, really, from the kind of lightweight camping that people might have experienced before. Basically, a hot tent is a tent, normally a fairly heavy tent, which is heated by a wood-burning stove. They come in various levels. There are lightweight tents that you can fold away and small, usually very light stoves that you can use for hot tenting. And then there's a sort of medium level, probably I suppose the level that I use, where I can haul it away from the road. And there's a heavier version, which people tend to just use from a car. But the great thing about hot tenting is that it allows you to camp in reasonable comfort in the coldest of weather.
So you came onto this, as I understand from your book, really coming out of COVID. You're a bothy lover, or a much more experienced in bothy use, shall I say? Because again, you've written a book on the bothy tales, of course. And I mean, personally, I've never found bothies the most attractive and coziest of places. It's an awful lot of effort to get the fire going and make the place feel a bit sort of welcoming, unless it's really horrible weather and you're just glad to get out of the weather for a few minutes. So how does your type of hot tent, first of all, tell us, what is your hot tent, which particular one, so people can visualise it? I'll pull up some pictures while you're talking, and you can explain what the tent is.
Well, okay, the tent I've got is a 10 teepee Sapphire 7, and it's based, although it's a fairly new design for us in the UK, actually it's based on a very old design that the Sami people, who were reindeer herders right on the Arctic Circle, they used tents like similar to these, and they needed a tent obviously that was portable, but would also enable them to keep warm below zero, and would keep them out, would withstand the weather. And so this is, as you can see, the tent it's what's called, you would call a bell tent. But the major difference with this type of tent is that should you get wet, or as you probably know, it now and again it rains in Scotland, and if you get soaked, then you can get yourself dried out and you're warm and comfortable for the following day. And that's really quite important, particularly if you're on a multi-day trip. So the tent is it's a single skin, which normally with a nylon tent means you're probably going to get wet, to be honest. But it's well ventilated. And as you can see from I've got a big stove like that. That's a really powerful wood burning stove. And the stove can produce quite a considerable amount of heat. It doesn't matter how cold it gets, that stove will keep you warm and dry. So in a nutshell, really, that's hot tenting.
And do you find the material, because the material of the tent is canvas, isn't it, of that particular one rather
That's
than
right.
nylon? So it dries out very quickly and will cope with the massive amount of heat that comes out of that stove.
That's right. The canvas for that particular tent is treated. So what you find is it's breathable, but in a sense, it doesn't really get wet. I know it sounds a strange idea, but what I'm trying to sort of convey is that any water that falls on any rain or any condensation, there's very little of that really, just sits on the surface of the material. So I live in a little flat, to be honest, although it's a masonette, so I've got stairs. So if it gets wet, I just drape it over the stairs, and actually the tent dries out overnight. So it's pretty waterproof from that point of view, and not too heavy or difficult to dry out.
Okay, well, we've got some video clips which I've taken from your YouTube channel, which I'm going to play now, which will show, hopefully, you putting the tent up in some pretty ropey conditions, in all fairness. I think,
But it's
I
Scotland,
think, yeah. Well, as you say, I gather it does rain occasionally. So I think perhaps you could just talk us through the experience of. I mean, everybody puts a tent up in bad weather. Obviously, a tent which is of the size and weight that you're talking about, we'll see in the video you actually putting it into the cart, dragging it across some boards, and getting it to your location to put up, and then obviously putting it up in a good hoolie. But at the very end of it, which is a fairly short period of time, you're actually quite toasty and warm. So,
yeah.
talk us through the practicalities of this.
Okay, well, this is us arriving in the Highlands. And as you can see, it's the weather's lovely. It's quite windy and it's very wet. And this particular campsite, um, you cross this wee river here, and then you head off across this. I have to say, at times, fairly intimidating boardwalk. It doesn't look too bad there, but if you get caught in a high wind, and the reason for the boardwalk really is that the area that we're walking over is actually very prone to flooding. This is not far from Achnasheen, if anyone knows Achnasheen in the Highlands, and so the river can rise and absolutely flood that area. So where we're walking now, you could quite easily, to be honest, be walking over a couple of feet of water. The lock that you can just about see takes over that area. Now, this is me constructing or putting up my tent. The great thing about any bell tent is that it's really simple to put up. The difference with this tent, what you do is you peg out the skirt of the tent. That's what I've done there. And then it really is very easy to erect because it's one pole, just one pole. And as soon as you locate that pole in the center, then the tent is up to a degree and gives you some shelter. Um, there, I'm probably struggling to find a hole in the middle of the moment there, and we might be able to see if we look up. Well, we can't really see it, but there are ventilation channels around the base of the tent, and it has a best way to describe it really is a kind of conical hat, and that ventilates the tent. That's me constructed the stove. As you can see, it's a pretty substantial piece of kit, and it needs to be in a way really. And that again, that's actually very easy to put up. It just folds up, and then the chimney goes through the top of the tent, which is what I'm doing there. And you can see there's the vents at the top. That's the chimney in place. And there I am just lighting the fire. Now, the great advantage, you mentioned bothies, but the great advantage of a hot tent over a bothy is that it warms up in about 5 minutes.
Right, right. What I mean, there's obviously a fair amount of expense involved in this, and we'll come on to that towards the end because I'm sure people that are wanting to
Yeah,
consider this as an option
sure.
will probably take a gasp initially at the figures. But as you quite rightly
Yes.
say in your book, when you compare it to camper van life, if that's a sort of luxury that people want, it actually is quite affordable by comparison.
Yeah.
It's more a case. I think I'd like you to tell us how it feels when you've got to a place where you're on your own. Obviously, you took friends with you on that particular video,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
when you're on your own and you've got your comfort, what makes it really comfortable for you? I see pictures of there of sheepskin rugs and all sorts of things.
That's right.
So
That's right.
describe what you've put in your cart. You've obviously got your tent, you've got your stove, presumably you've got fuel, some sort of food.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Just talk us through what that lifestyle feels like when you're sort of ensconced and
Well,
sitting there and
yes.
everything is right with the world.
Okay, well, you see, I always think any fool can be uncomfortable. It takes real skill to sit there in luxury. And so what I've got, what I carry, and I shift stuff around in the garden cart that you saw me using there, because that allows me to get as some distance from the road. But I know I wouldn't. The most important thing I've got carpets, bits of old carpets that people gave me, and there's something really nice about sitting beside your wood burning stove. And I've got a really comfortable folding chair. So I get in my little tent, set it up. It doesn't matter how cold it is, I'll be warm in there. And what I really like to do, to be honest, is I'm a great lover of old-fashioned style paraffin lamps. And what it's difficult to describe is that I always find the tent actually very atmospheric. It's a canvas tent. It's an old style tent. It almost feels as though Shackleton or Scott could turn up at any moment, knock the snow off their boots, and come in and join you. And to be honest, if they did that, they probably wouldn't feel out of place. You can go to places like Sutherland, where they're very wild, they're quite remote, and particularly in the winter, you will see very, very few people. And I do like that. I do like that feeling of, I'm in there with my little tent. I've got my stove on, my oil lamps burning, and probably the only light for 5 or 6 miles is speck, that little speck of light in the tent. And so it gives me a really unique feeling, I think. And the great thing, obviously, also is that I feel pretty secure in that tent. There's not much going to happen to that tent. That's it. I've got the vents open at the top there. You can see. Not much is going to shift that thing. The conical shape is a really good shape for shrugging off the wind. It's a bit like a boxer. It rolls with the punches, and so it very hard for the wind to get hold of it, because there's no flat. If you have a flat-sided tent or one that's fairly high, it's going to get hit by the wind, whereas that tent isn't. So I think there's I don't know. I think it feels a very unique experience out there in what is a pretty unique tent in a way, really.
So once you've established your camp, I mean, one question I'm sure a lot of people will be wondering is: here you are in the wilds of Scotland, in some magnificent location like that. Do you stay sitting in the tent for the 3 or 4 days, or do you go off for a walk? And if you do go off for a walk, are you worried about your security or the security of your shelter, as regards people, invading it in some format or other?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the answer is that I do leave it. I do. I will normally go for a walk, and that is one of the pleasures, actually. Sometimes, I'll go for a walk in the local hills, and you can see this little tiny cone, yellow cone, sometimes sitting several miles away, and I'll come back to it, and I might be a bit wet, a bit cold, a bit tired, and within minutes you're comfortable and you're relaxed again. So it's fantastic for a walking base. Um, and obviously, I'm fortunate to live in the Highlands. It's a relatively crime-free area. I do leave the tent. To be quite honest, I don't think there'd be much point in me having the tent if I couldn't leave it and come back to it. And there might be some risk to that. I've heard of someone getting a tent pinched, although they had left it for several days. Um, yeah, there's a chance, there's a risk that it'll wander. I've never had any problems so far, but it's a kind of risk I'm happy to take, really. I guess if you're in England, it might be different.
Yeah, I just think, as you were saying that, actually, I was just trying to think. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody losing anything when have had a camp somewhere in the Highlands when I've been through in the last 15
No.
years or so. I've certainly seen people inquire about odd rucksacks they may have found where people obviously dropped them at the bottom of Munro and they've done a quick bag.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
nobody's, I've ever not heard of that, which is a good thing, which is a good thing to hear, really, and reassuring when you've got, several quid's worth of equipment sitting there
yeah, yeah.
that's potentially vulnerable. Now, in the book, you've got sort of 6 or 7 places that you mention as being particular favourites of
Yes.
yours. And most of them, when I've mapped them out now on the map here, most of them are obviously fairly close to the road. But I presume those roads are not particularly well populated, well, all year
No,
round.
no.
Tell us about. Well, I've got Kinloch Horn on the screen at the moment. Tell us about that one.
I think, oh well, I call it the monkey puzzle campsite. Because as you can see there, there's that road is probably the biggest cul-de-sac in Britain, as far as I know. Yeah, you would come in from the east of that image on the map, and there you can see that the road leaves the main road between well, I suppose between Skye and Fort William, really, and it follows along this great long loch for 22 miles. And it's a winding single track road for the most part. And it gets more and more remote. And what I like about it is there's hills all the way along it. And when you finally descend to the little campsite that I use there, you're very remote indeed. In the winter, you could probably go for a couple of days and you might not see another car. Certainly in the summer, I think you might expect to see one car an hour, something like that. So that is a remote spot. And of course, the great thing about that little area there is that you've got hills all around you and paths coming down. So it's a great spot for walking too. So it's one of my favorite little places, that.
I noticed along that road, you've got the Tom Doone Hotel, which I've visited a few times over the years when I've been walking across Scotland. That's now changed. Is that now a private house?
Yes, I think that closed a few years ago. It's no longer an open hotel, as far as I know.
Yeah, because the last time I was there, it was under development and it was fenced off. So I was curious to see
Yeah,
what
yeah,
became of
yeah.
it. But it was a real oasis in the middle of nowhere, really, when it was in its heyday.
It is. It is. Well, there is, in theory at least, a cafe at Kinlochhorn which has never been open, as far as I've found. But every time I've been there, and there's a wee sign 22 miles away that points to the cafe. And I always think if you've driven 22 miles and you get there and there's no cafe, it must be a bit of a downer.
Yes, yeah, definitely a way to take your own stuff. I did ask you what you also put in your cart, and I don't think you completed the question there. You've got your stove, the fuel, obviously your tent. What other items make it a luxury moment for you?
Well, I mean, obviously I've got you could, if you wish, have a folding bed. There's lots of different camp beds about. I just use the inflatable mattress that I normally use, which is a Thermalite, or a Thermarest, is it? I think they're
The
called.
rest, yeah,
Brilliant
yeah.
little thing. I'm so used to it, and it's really comfortable. And obviously, it's very well insulated from the ground, so I sleep on that in all weathers, really. I always take a little gas stove, so a camping gas stove, so that if I want to make a quick brew, I can. But if you want to cook on the wood burning stove, you can do that as well. You can cook real food, none of this dehydrated nonsense. You can fry up. You can have your, I think, spaghetti bolognese or chili or whatever, and you can make that from fresh ingredients, which I think when you're camping is always a big boon, really. So yeah, it's got all those sort of luxuries, and I can't think what else ever else I've got really. So usually take some electrical kit with me. It's always good idea to have a torch and a spade for the loo, of course. But
Yeah.
I think it's really important for me. One of the important things whenever I camp, I practice leave no trace camping. I never burn. I always take my wood with me. I never burn anything that's there. I never have a campfire. I've got my little stove, and I always like to, when I leave nothing behind other than a patch of a flat grass. That's really quite important to me.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Well, let's actually come on to the stove now. As a matter of interest, if you were staying for somewhere for 2 or 3 days, how much fuel would that stove get through? What do you have to consider?
Um, well, it depends. It depends how cold it is, obviously. And sort of, I tend to camp in the winter quite a lot. That's my favourite time. The downside of the winter, obviously, is that the days are pretty short.
Mm,
Particularly, in December, you can be in the dark from 4 o'clock onwards in the afternoon. So you'll go through a more amount of fuel. What I would say about fuel is I always take kiln dried hardwood. I find that burns really
yeah.
well. It burns quite relatively slowly because what you have to do is be able to shut the stove down as much as you can so that it burns relatively slowly. Because if you give it its head and you fill it full of logs, you'll be outside. You'll be standing outside the tent waiting for it to cool down. It really it loves giving out heat.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
its reason
But
for living, really. So
but
you
what's the
probably
actual
get
volume
through
though? A couple of bags?
no less than that. For
Oh,
I
really?
would say if you've got decent logs, you probably would go through half a dozen logs in an evening.
Okay.
If you're there from 4 o'clock onwards, you might have to add another two or three logs, but you're really not carrying a vast amount of wood with you. Enough that you would quite. So I suppose there's the sort of bags of wood logs that you're likely to see in a supermarket that are kiln dried hardwood. Probably, I would take maybe half of one of those, and that'll easily last me 2 days.
And do you keep the stove in all night long?
No, you probably could do that. I can't see the point personally because I tend to take in the winter. Obviously, I've got a pretty good sleeping bag, so I put my woolly hat on and my fleecy pajamas and get in the sleeping bag with my teddy bear, and I'm very I get myself all covered over, and the stove will burn itself out after about an hour and a half if you just leave it.
Yeah.
Um, and I find, to be honest, I'm warm enough in my bag. I don't try and keep the stove on all night. If in order to keep the stove on all night, you'd have to have it running so slowly that the amount of heat it gave out would probably wouldn't keep you warm. I'm probably completely. There probably are ways of running it all night if you want to, but I can't see the point. And the great thing, obviously, is if I get up in the morning and it's below zero or whatever, and I'm feeling a bit shivery, I can light the stove again. It's lit. It's up to operating temperature in less than 5 minutes, and you'll be
Okay.
warm.
I,
So
I,
it's great from that point of view.
and of course, the other question with regard stoves in tents is carbon monoxide poisoning. What's your preparation to cover you for that? We'll come on to the video that they've got of the stove in a second while you're
Okay.
explaining this.
Well, obviously, you want to be careful with anything, anything that burns that exhausts into the tent. And obviously, the thing about the stove is that the stove actually exhausts out of the tent. The carbon monoxide that it undoubtedly produces is chucked out above you, so it's actually not an issue. I have, on occasion, when it's not been very cold at all, I've heated the tent with two paraffin lamps. Now you can do that, and I've also taken with me, obviously, a carbon monoxide detector. But even so, to be honest, even when I've had the tent completely closed down, I've not used the wood burning stove. I've just used the two oil lamps with the carbon monoxide detector sitting there. It's never gone off. So it
Right,
doesn't
right.
seem you do need to be careful, obviously, with anything that you're burning inside a tent that produces carbon monoxide. But I've
Yeah.
not found it to be an issue.
Okay, cool. Right, well, let's just run this video then of the from the stove manufacturers from TP, and perhaps you can just sort of comment on a couple of the key features, if you would.
Yeah, that's the Edfell stove. What you can see there is the door that you load it from, and those are the components. All the chimney and everything else fits inside the stove. He's wearing gloves because it can be a bit sharp, some of the edges. Also, that's a lovely shiny new stove that has hardly been used. After a while, they do get covered in soot. There's no two ways about it. That locks, that little pin he put in there locks the chimney in place, and he's moving so fast I can't keep up with him. That he sets it up there, and they're using a couple of poles for stability. You can do that if you wish. And what you do is you assemble it's a bit like those Russian dolls, you know. One fits inside the other. The mesh tube at the top, that is a heat dissipator, if you like, and that goes through. That's the part that goes through the tent, and that effectively hangs on a little chain from the top of the chimney. And what that means is that the part of the chimney that goes through the tent never gets so hot that it will damage the canvas. You can see it there. It cools. I was quite worried when I first used it. I wasn't sure whether that would work, but actually it works a treat. Uh, he's got a little there's a bit of mesh at the top, the insect mesh. There's someone loading, obviously, the wood burning stove up. You can see it's quite hot. And then there he is putting it away, putting one inside another, ready to go back in its little box. It weighs about 20 kilograms, let me tell you that. So it is not the lightest of things you will find. But there's nothing quite like it. So
Is
I
it
find, to be honest.
is it once the stove's been used a few times, does it still pack away easily? Because I found that the stove that
Yes,
I
it does.
use, which is a
One modification I've made to the stove is that I've fitted a little damper plate down at the bottom of the chimney. I think that's a really useful thing to do.
mm,
It means that you can control the heat because the stove is determined to reduce everything around it to a molten state if it can. But it's nice to be able to control it. That way you can keep it. And that's just the damper is just a little round disc that fits inside the chimney. When you do that, you can't get everything back in together. You've got to have this separate, but it's worth doing that. But I find, yeah, it's easy enough to put away. I've not had an issue doing that at all. And what if you've used it a fair bit? What you will find is that there can be a little bit of a tar build up in the chimney. But that's very easy to deal with. Basically, you just wash it with hot water detergent and it comes away. And it doesn't really affect the way the stove runs at all, and it also smells great.
have you lost any bits? 'Cause, I mean, obviously, anything that takes a lot of component parts, sometimes it's very easy to leave it in the grass by accident, and it's quite an extensive setup you got there. Have you lost anything over the years?
No, not at all, really. I'm very careful that I count all my pegs and all, and I have, I carry spare pegs anyway. Just I did once leave home without the one of the sections of the chimney, which meant that I wasn't able to use the stove. But and I'm very, I have, I'm a bit anal with that. What I have is I have a packing list. On my little PC, and I print that off every time I go away, and I tick off everything that I'm packing. So surprisingly enough, actually, I don't think I've lost anything.
Well, that's to be congratulated. If nothing else, I would have thought with pulling anything, on a trolley over a reasonable distance, there's an opportunity for it to fall out the box or the bag or whatever it may be. But
Yeah.
fair play if you haven't lost anything. That's good. That's good. Right. Well, let's start frightening people now and give them an idea of how much this medium weight, this luxurious type of camping is going to cost them if they want to look at it. I've got the tent TP website here.
Sure.
It doesn't seem to give any prices. So, do you want to give people an idea of how much it's cost your investment so far?
Yeah, the setup that I've got, bearing in mind I bought this a few years ago, well, 2 or 3 years ago now, and obviously as it's showing, there's lots of different sizes. Um, It cost me it's about £2,000 for the tent now, and it's about £800 for that stove. I would say that there's a range of other types of tents available, and there are also that stove is, I suppose, fairly expensive, but you can buy smaller, less expensive stoves. And the point you made really earlier on, I sort of thought a long time before I invested that kind of money in a tent. But to be honest, it is super durable. I expect to be using that tent if I'm still around 20 years from now. And I may have had to reproof it, I may have had to repair it, but it's going to be still there and still just as good. And if you think about it, it's you can sit quite comfortably like that in it. And in some ways, it is like a camper van. You've got that kind of comfort. There's no showers or toilet, but apart from that, you've got pretty much everything else you could need. So you could accommodate 4 people quite comfortably in the Sapphire 7, which is the model I've got. So that's what it costs anyway.
And the stove itself, did you say how much that cost?
Yeah, the stove. I think the tent's about 2,000. Stove's about. And last time I looked, it's about £800. But you can get stoves at about £150, which I would probably do the job. I'm not too sure about that. I think if anyone's thinking of buying the tent, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend the tent. I think it's brilliant. You can look around for different stoves. The Edfell is designed to operate in Norway, someone like that. It wouldn't bother it if it was -20, -30 outside. It has the power to do that, but it's a bit. I do sometimes think that it's maybe a little bit too powerful for the tent that I've got, but I've no experience of using other stoves, so I can't
Right.
really compare them. But you certainly could save a bit of money on it. You get a smaller stove, and I think it would probably do the job okay. You just have to
Yeah.
make sure that the chimney was big enough to reach the top of your tent, obviously, because you don't want it too short.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are obviously smaller tents and smaller
Yeah.
stoves, as you rightly say. I mean, these the Lux ones are definitely more that the type of weight and size that you could carry some distance.
Yeah.
But when compared to the size and durability of a heavy duty canvas tent, they're definitely a different category, and that's obviously an outbacker
Yes.
or similar stove, an outbacker stove, which, as you say, is about the sort of 150 £200 mark, which does the job for that type
Yes.
of size and shape.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But it's all
Absolutely.
relative, it's all relative. It's just like anything, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can spend 500 or 600 quid, or you can spend 2 or 3 thousand. It's you get what you pay
Yeah.
for, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's come on to as soon as I can find them. Bear with me a second. It's here somewhere. Let's come on to this book of yours.
Oh,
Now,
right.
yeah, here we go. The Hot Tent Diaries. Is it available, and where will it be available, and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, the Hot Tent Diaries, it really is. Well, if anyone's read any of my other books, Mothy Tales or The Last Hill Walker, they'll know that essentially it's full of yarns and stories and lies, really. But it's about when the pandemic kicked in and I wanted to find an alternative to the remote Highland bothies that I stayed in. I tried a number of different tents and really couldn't find one that was suitable until I discovered the 10 TP Sapphire 7. And so the book really charts that, and there's a few little stories. There's even some poetry along the way, and it tells you how I learned. And any piece of equipment you have, particularly if it's very different from what you're used to, you kind of have to learn its strengths and weaknesses. You have to learn how to use it. And the hot tent is camping. It's very, very different from a small, lightweight tent. It functions very differently, and you've got to get used to that and find out what its capabilities are. And so basically, I give some sort of tips as to the sort of stuff that I take with me. And I talk a little bit about, as you said, places to camp. And my idea really was to just give maybe, I think it's about a dozen places where you could camp that I've found that are quite good. But the joy really of anything, any camping like that is going and finding out for yourself, exploring it for yourself. So I just give enough information really, I suppose, for people to get started. And then the trick is to work out, what layout in the tent works for you, where you like to be, what kind of camping you like to do, and really adapt it for your own needs. So the book is, as far as I know, it is the only hot tent book in the world. So it's unique.
Marvellous.
And that's
Now,
go on.
well, as I say, your website, johnhburns.com, is one place. Is it
John D. Burns, it is.
Sorry, beg your pardon. John D. Burns. Is it available Amazon and through any other wholesalers?
It's available from Amazon. What I've done is it's available as a paperback book, a single paperback book. But what I've done is it's also available as an ebook, but the ebook is split into three. So if you just want to treat it like a magazine, I suppose, you just buy a bite-sized version of the book, and if you like it, you can buy the other two volumes. Just wanted to make it convenient for people who are perhaps on a you're sort of on a commute, or you're going somewhere and you think, oh, I want something fairly lightweight, short to read. Well, you can buy it in three different sections. And it's also available, the paperback, if you're someone who likes to buy stuff from independent bookshops, then you can buy it from Fort William Bookshop, and they operate mail order.
Well, that's fantastic. I think we've touched on most things that will be of interest to everybody. Is there anything that you think that we should have talked about that we haven't talked about related to the hot tent experience and well, obviously your book as well?
I don't think so. I think it's the most important thing, I think, is to tailor make the experience to yourself and just to enjoy being out in wild places. And it's great if you've got something that makes you feel comfortable and makes you feel secure. And that's what a hot tent does for me. It's a funny thing. I've been exploring the Highlands for over 40 years, but the hot tent has taken me to places I wouldn't normally have gone to. And it's also allowed me to, I used to use bothies, but obviously there aren't bothies everywhere. There are bothies in some places. So it's enabled me to go to different places. And the great thing I like about it also is that it's fantastic as a base camp. You can go for a walk, come back down, you've got your food, you've got everything there, and it's warm and dry. You get your kit dried out, you go the following day. It's fantastic for that. So it's really opened up a new way of exploring the Highlands for me.
I think the only thing that I didn't ask you at the very beginning when we saw the picture of you, the video, you putting the tent up, is actually how long does it take on an average day to get it up and get yourself sorted, as it were, in tent, fire, not necessarily with the fire on, but everything erected, and you are officially camping as opposed to.
Takes me about 45 minutes, but you've got to remember that's me putting my carpets in, my chair, all my food, all my luxuries. If you just wanted to it is a very quick tent to put up. You can get the actual basic tent up in well under 5 minutes. Well under.
Okay.
But I've got a floor I fit in, and carpets and all. Getting it to the deluxe version takes a little while, but you can do it quite quick if you just want the basic tent as a shelter.
Right. You get the sideboard in and the lampshades and the flowers.
TV. And exactly. It's hell getting the jacuzzi in,
Well, John, thanks very much indeed for your time. I do appreciate it, and I wish you all the best with the book.
Been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much.
My thanks to John for joining me for that conversation, and as I say, his book is now available. All the links to everything we discuss in that conversation can be found over on the outdoorstation.co.uk website. And as I say, while you're there, please leave a comment and join our newsletter. The other thing I was going to ask a favour of is I noticed recently that my iTunes reviews, the last one was 2019. It would be really nice if people could spend a few moments to write, well, something nice. in the review section of iTunes. So if you get a moment and you have a coffee for a second and you've enjoyed these podcasts and videos, then please write something there. I'll be very grateful. Thank you very much. So folks, until next time, stay nice and warm in those tents out there. It's going to get chilly this winter, and hopefully we'll be back very soon with another podcast and video for you. Until next time, bye for now.